Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into something called the compounding divide, specifically how assets outpace income. If you've ever looked around the financial world and wondered why some people seem to just pull ahead so rapidly without doing anything differently day to day, well, you are absolutely in the right place. To really grasp how this structural system works, let's start with a highly relatable scenario.
Okay, so let's picture two identical workers. We've got worker A and worker B. Now, they start out in the exact same place in life. We're talking the exact same salary, same education, same grueling hours, and the same exact effort at the office. Yet somehow, 10 years later, their lives completely separate. Worker A is still calculating their monthly budget down to the exact dollar, while worker B's wealth is quietly multiplying while they sleep. So how does that happen?
The really strange part about this is nothing obvious was taken from the first person. There was no theft. There was no rule broken here, no visible loss on their ledger whatsoever. This invisible divergence, it's not a crime, and it's definitely not a magic trick. It just mathematically happens completely underneath the surface of their daily routines.
When we zoom out a bit, you see this pattern repeating structurally across entire economies. It fundamentally splits the modern financial world into two very distinct categories. What you earn, so your income and wages, versus what you own, your assets and capital. And the reality is, most people live almost entirely in earning, but the wealthy, they live primarily in owning.
To really understand why, we have to start with a concept most people never even question. Money sitting still is not neutral. It decays. While cash sitting in a savings account appears perfectly stable, its purchasing power functionally evaporates. Just for some context, historically, fiat currencies lose about half their purchasing power every couple of decades simply through baseline inflation. Even without dramatic global news or crises, the economic ground is constantly moving. If you hold money in its simplest form, you are quite literally holding something designed to be unstable over time.
Now, in stark contrast to cash, assets actively react. Think about it. A piece of property collects rent, yielding steady cash. Businesses generate active cash flow every single quarter. Stocks represent a dynamic claim on future earnings and equity. Assets are dynamic. They actively attempt to expand their value rather than just acting as a static, decaying storage unit.
And this brilliantly illustrates the core mechanical difference at the heart of our explainer today. The system simply does not treat a spending tool equally to a compounding tool. Money is fundamentally a medium of transfer, designed to be spent. Assets, on the other hand, are tools of accumulation, designed specifically for compounding.
This becomes extremely rigid when you introduce leverage. Modern economies don't just reward ownership, they massively amplify it through a leverage feedback loop. It works like this. You start with a small asset base, which acts as collateral, granting you access to low-cost credit. Then, you use that borrowed money to acquire a larger asset base, which in turn unlocks access to even more credit. It's a relentless compounding engine.
Meanwhile, if you don't own assets, you participate in the economy mostly through wages. And wages are a form of economic participation tied directly to your time. They reset continually rather than compounding. You do the work, you get paid, and bam, the clock resets back to zero for the next 2 weeks. This places the wage earner entirely outside of that powerful compounding feedback loop we just talked about.
Let's analyze this friction objectively by looking at inflation. When prices rise, capital and property adjust upward incredibly fast. Real estate values bump up, corporate pricing updates, and asset holders benefit first. But wages? They are notoriously sticky. They adjust slowly, relying on delayed negotiations and locked-in contracts. That mechanical delay creates a massive, widening separation in wealth.
Furthermore, let's trace the actual flow of new money entering the system. In economics, you might know this as the Cantillon effect. New liquidity doesn't just spread evenly across the board. It enters through financial markets first, reaching asset owners and allowing them to buy before prices fully adjust. By the time that exact same new money trickles down to everyday spenders, it has already expressed itself as higher living costs.
Now, I want to be very grounded here. It's not a conspiracy. It really is just timing. There are no villains actively plotting to widen the wealth gap in some smoky back room. What we are neutrally observing is the pure structural advantage of timing in finance. Getting to the new money first absolutely changes everything.
Obviously, assets absolutely come with real risks. They can fall in value or just stagnate for a decade. But structurally speaking, they sit much closer to the actual growth engines of the economy. Currency is just the medium where the everyday transactions happen, but assets are where the value sits and expands.
Over a generation, that difference is entirely defining.
Because of this dynamic, the most common financial advice you'll hear is simply to buy assets. But honestly, that often feels deeply inadequate, right? Because it completely ignores the steep barriers just to get to the starting line. Acquiring assets requires hefty down payments, a high risk tolerance, specialized financial education, and rock-solid income stability.
So the crucial point here is that the real divide in modern finance isn't actually about assets versus currency at all. It is fundamentally about access versus exposure. Do you have access to systems that actively compound, or are you only left with exposure to systems that continually reset?
Because this process happens so incredibly slowly, day by day, it doesn't look like an economic collapse. It just looks like normal life continuing, just unevenly. Over a generation, the system consistently rewards one type of ownership slightly more than the other, letting time do all the heavy lifting without ever directly taking a single cent from anyone's pocket.
Which brings us to a final, profound question to consider today. At what point does a system built on this fundamental difference stop feeling like an economy and start feeling like a quiet sorting mechanism? It's an invisible process mechanically sorting our financial realities while everyone is simply living their daily lives. Keep questioning the mechanics around you, and thanks for joining me for this explainer.